My brother shoved the papers across the table at me and said, "Sign it. Unless you want to explain to Mom why you stole from her." I didn't steal anything, but I signed. And 3 days later, I watched a sheriff's deputy walk up my driveway while my brother stood at the end of the street, watching, hands in his pockets, the faintest smile on his face. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love knowing who's out there. 22 hours before that deputy knocked on my door, my brother called me crying. "I need to tell you something important about that call." Not what he said. What I felt the moment I saw his name light up my screen. My stomach dropped. Not because I was worried about him, because I knew, the way you know when a storm is coming before the clouds even turn, that whatever he was about to say was going to cost me something. My name is not important. What's important is that for 31 years I was the responsible one. The one who showed up. The one who quietly fixed things so the family picture stayed pretty. My brother, I'll call him my brother because that's all he ever really was to me, a title, not a relationship, is 4 years older than me. He was the one who got the standing ovations at the dinner table, the one my mother introduced at parties as my son, the one who works in finance. He drove a car that cost more than my first 2 years of rent, combined, wore clothes I couldn't afford to look at, and had a laugh that filled a room in a way that made everyone forget to ask the quieter questions. Questions like, where does the money actually come from? Why does he need a new investor every 18 months? Why does he flinch when anyone mentions the SEC? I didn't ask those questions. I was the designated non-asker, the keeper of the peace. The one who smiled at Christmas dinner and said, "He's doing great," when relatives asked about him, even when I knew the truth was something closer to a controlled collapse. That's what they don't tell you about being the responsible sibling. It's not a personality trait. It's a survival skill you developed so young you forgot you were ever doing it. So when he called me that Tuesday evening, voice cracking, telling me our mother had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia, and that he needed my help managing her finances before things got complicated, I said yes. What I didn't say was, "Why are you calling me now, when you haven't visited her in 8 months?" What I didn't say was, "What do you mean by manage?" Exactly. What I didn't say was, "Why do you sound more stressed about the finances than about her?" He told me Mom had already signed a document giving him limited power of attorney over her savings account, the one with her retirement money in it, a little over $240,000, but that she needed a second authorized signatory for the transfer process, someone the bank would recognize, someone trustworthy. He needed me to go to the bank with him. Sign a form. Just a formality, he said, just to make sure the funds were accessible if Mom needed memory care on short notice. I drove to my mother's house the next morning. She was sitting in the kitchen in her housecoat, drinking decaf and doing the crossword. She looked up when I came in and said my name with such warmth that I felt the tightness in my chest ease just slightly. She seemed okay. A little slower than usual. She repeated one question twice about whether I'd eaten breakfast, and she couldn't remember the word perimeter for a few seconds, but nothing that screamed emergency. Nothing that explained the urgency in my brother's voice. When I asked her about the power of attorney, she said yes, she'd signed something. Her son had explained it all to her. It was to help with the medical bills. She called him a good boy. I stood in her kitchen holding my coffee, and something in my gut tightened again. The same cold feeling from the night before. I looked at the crossword on the table. She'd filled in most of it correctly. She was present. She was lucid. But she trusted him completely, and I was standing there in her kitchen, already halfway into the frame he'd built around me, not yet realizing I was inside it. My brother picked me up at 11. He was dressed like he was going to a business lunch, not a bank visit with his sick mother. He was cheerful in the way people are cheerful when they're performing cheerfulness. Slightly too loud, slightly too smooth, eyes not quite matching the smile. At the bank, we met with an associate in one of those small glass offices. My brother did most of the talking. I signed where he pointed, The form authorized me as a secondary contact on a trust account in my mother's name, he said. Just a formality. Just a safety net. I did not read the form as carefully as I should have. I need you to understand something about why. It wasn't carelessness. It wasn't stupidity. It was 31 years of my brother being the one who handled things, which meant my role was always to show up and support the plan already in motion. When you grow up as the secondary character in your own family story, you stop expecting to need to audit the plot. I signed the form. We had lunch at a diner down the street. He paid, which surprised me. He asked about my job, my apartment, my life. He was warm in a way he almost never was. I remember thinking maybe things are changing. Maybe this is the turning point. I drove home feeling something I can only describe as cautious hope. 48 hours later, my mother called me. She was not doing the crossword. She was crying. Her bank had flagged a wire transfer. $180,000 had been moved from her savings to an account she didn't recognize. The bank had put a hold on it. Thank God. But they needed her to come in with her authorization documents. And when she'd called my brother to ask what was happening, he'd told her she must have misunderstood. He'd told her she was confused. He'd told her to call me. Because I was the one who'd signed the transfer form. I sat on my kitchen floor for a long time after that call. Not because I was falling apart. Because I was trying to understand the shape of what was happening. I was trying to trace the architecture of it. The fake emergency to create urgency. The cheerful bank visit to make everything feel routine. The form I'd signed without reading carefully enough. The 2 days of silence while the transfer processed. And now the redirect. Call your sister. Mom. She handled the paperwork. He had built a box around me and handed me the walls himself, one at a time, and I had helped him assemble it. The knock at my door came the next morning at 8:47 a.m. I know the time, because I'd just started my second cup of coffee and I checked my phone when I heard the sound of a car on the gravel outside my apartment building. A deputy from the county sheriff's office. Behind him, a woman in a blazer I didn't recognize. Financial Crimes Unit, she said, showing me a badge. They had received a complaint. My mother's attorney had filed a report with Adult Protective Services, alleging financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. My name was on the transfer document. My signature was on file. I opened my mouth, I closed it, and I thought about saying, "You have the wrong person," and I thought about saying, "Call my brother." What came out was nothing. Complete silence. The kind that doesn't come from not knowing what to say. It comes from suddenly understanding, with cold clarity, that nothing you say in this moment will sound like anything except what a guilty person would say. I let them in. I sat at my kitchen table. I answered questions in a voice that didn't sound like mine. People who have never been falsely accused think that innocence makes you calm, that you'll say, "I didn't do it," with such conviction that the room will feel it. But that's not what happens when your whole life has taught you that your version of events is always the one that gets corrected, questioned, overridden. When you've grown up being told, implicitly and explicitly, that your instincts are wrong, and your perceptions are unreliable, and your feelings are an overreaction. When the woman in the blazer laid the documents on my table and said, "Can you explain why you authorized a transfer of $180,000 from your mother's savings account?" I looked at my own signature on the page and I felt something terrifying. I wasn't sure. Not about whether I'd done it. I knew I hadn't intended this. But had I understood what I signed? Had I missed something? Had my brother somehow told me what was happening and I had blocked it out? Had I been so conditioned to trust his version of events that I had just not processed what was right in front of me? That is the true nature of being gaslit for decades. It doesn't just distort the past. It makes you uncertain of your own presence in the present moment. I sat at my kitchen table with my signature on a document that was being used to build a case against me. And for a few terrible seconds, I wondered if I had somehow done this and just not understood what I was doing. That was the moment I stopped being quiet. Not because I had a plan. Because the alternative was worse. The alternative was disappearing into someone else's story about me and never finding my way back. I want an attorney, I said. My voice was level. I want to call my mother's bank directly. And I want you to pull the full surveillance footage from that branch on the day I was there. The woman in the blazer looked at me for a long moment. Then she wrote something down. What I didn't know, sitting at that table, was that 40 minutes away in my brother's apartment, something was already unraveling. His girlfriend. I'd met her twice, quiet woman, worked in accounting, always seemed slightly uncomfortable in his presence. In a way I'd never let myself name, had been in his home office the night before looking for the printer cable. She'd found something else, a folder. Inside it, a spreadsheet mapping the transfer timeline, a screenshot of the bank form before and after my signature was added, and an email chain with a shell company registered in Delaware that was not in my mother's name or mine. She had photographed everything on her phone. She hadn't said a word to him, she'd gone to bed. In the morning, she'd driven to a copy shop, printed everything, and walked into the county courthouse. I didn't know any of this when I sat across from my attorney 2 hours later in a conference room that smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee. My attorney was a woman who wore flat shoes and spoke in short sentences, and had eyes that made you feel like she was reading the fine print of whatever you said before she responded. She listened to me for 40 minutes without interrupting. Then she said, "Your brother made one mistake. He used your signature to create paper legitimacy. But paper leaves a trail, and trails go both ways." The bank's hold on the transfer was still active. The shell company in Delaware had been registered 11 days before my mother's diagnosis appointment, which, my attorney pointed out, was 3 days before my brother told me about the diagnosis at all. The timeline didn't work unless you understood what it actually was. Not a response to a family emergency, but the triggering of a plan that had been in motion long before the phone call that felt like a crisis. He had manufactured the urgency. He had manufactured the diagnosis narrative. He had called me not because he needed my help, but because he needed my name. A second signature from the responsible, trustworthy sibling was the one thing that would make the transfer look legitimate enough to survive initial scrutiny. The woman in accounting sat across the table from a detective and laid the photographs out one by one, and my brother, who had spent his whole life being the golden son, the one whose reality was always the real one, sat in an interrogation room and tried to explain to a financial crimes investigator why his spreadsheet had my name in a column labeled cover. I was not in the room when the investigator set that spreadsheet down in front of him, but my attorney was told about it afterward. She said he went completely still. Then he said the documents had been manipulated. Then he said his girlfriend had a personal vendetta. Then he stopped talking and asked for his attorney. 3 things happened after that. The first, the wire transfer was fully reversed. My mother's $180,000 went back to her account, where it still sits today, managed now by a fiduciary appointed by the court. A professional with no last name shared with my mother, which turns out to be important. The second, my brother was charged with elder financial abuse, wire fraud, and document falsification. Under federal sentencing guidelines, the combination of those charges, given the amount involved and the deliberate targeting of a vulnerable adult, carries serious time. His attorney is negotiating. My attorney told me not to expect it to go to trial. People like him, she said, don't like the part where the spreadsheet gets shown to a jury. The third thing that happened was smaller. It happened in my mother's living room on a Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks after everything collapsed. I was there helping her reorganize some papers. She was having a good day. Clear, present, sharp in that way she still has sometimes. She looked at me across the coffee table and she said, "I should have asked more questions." I thought she meant about the documents. She meant about him. About all of it. About the years she'd spent believing his version of things because it was louder. I didn't tell her she was wrong to trust him. She's my mother and she's sick, and she did the best she could with the information she had. But I did say, Mom, you're asking questions now. That's what matters. She nodded. She went back to her papers, but her hand found mine on the cushion between us, and squeezed once, quick, before she let go. I live in the same apartment I've always lived in. I didn't move, didn't change my number, didn't flee. I thought about it. The particular exhaustion of being the person a family scandal orbits around, even when you're the one it was done to. But I stayed. My brother's girlfriend and I have never spoken about what she did. I sent her a text 2 weeks after everything came out. It said, "I don't know how to thank you for what you did. You didn't have to." She replied 12 hours later with, "I know." And that was the whole conversation. Some things don't need more words than that. My mother is in a memory care facility now, a good one, paid for properly, with a plan in place that her attorney and her fiduciary and I review every quarter. She has a room with a window that faces a garden. She still does crossword puzzles, the easy ones now. She still says my name like she means it. I go every Sunday. My brother and I have no contact. He sent one message through his attorney asking if I would write a character letter for sentencing. My attorneys responded on my behalf. Briefly, here is the thing I want to say to anyone who is listening and recognizing something in this story. Being the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who shows up and signs the form and says yes, because saying no always came with a cost. That's not weakness. That's what happens when someone has spent years quietly teaching you that your value to the family depends on your compliance. You don't learn to ask questions because asking questions was always punished. You learn to sign where you're told and trust that the people who love you would not use that trust as a weapon. They would not, mostly, until they do. And when they do, the worst part is not the betrayal. The worst part is the split second when you see your own signature on the document and you have to fight. Fight hard, not to believe that maybe you are exactly who they're saying you are. I fought. I'm still here. That signature was the only thing of mine that was ever part of his plan. Everything else. My name, my integrity, my relationship with my mother. He never actually had access to. He just made me forget that for a while. I remembered. And the floor he built his whole scheme on turned out to be paper too.